The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Clara's spacious backyard as neighbors gathered, laughter and chatter filling the air. Margaret, 68, carefully carried out a tray of her homemade cookies, her hands trembling slightly but her heart warm with the hope of being useful. She offered them around with a gentle smile, recalling how Thomas used to praise her baking. But as she approached Clara and her circle of friends, her daughter's sharp voice cut through the pleasant atmosphere. "Oh, Mom always insists on bringing these, she just doesn't know how to sit still. Sometimes it feels like having a child to look after instead of a guest." The group chuckled politely, unsure how to respond. Margaret's smile faltered, her cookies suddenly feeling heavy in her hands. She stood there for a moment, her cheeks burning, before quietly placing the tray on the table. No one reached for them right away. In that instant, Margaret felt herself fade into the background of her own daughter's life, present. It was a quiet evening, the soft hum of the dishwasher filling the kitchen. Margaret rinsed a glass to pour herself some water, her hands tired from the day. Suddenly, the slippery glass slipped from her grasp and shattered into jagged pieces on the tiled floor. Startled, she froze for a moment, then bent down slowly to gather the shards. Her joints ached as she carefully picked them up, whispering, "I'm sorry, just an accident." Clara stormed in at the sound, her face twisted with irritation. "For heaven's sake, Mom, how many times do I have to tell you to be careful? You could have hurt yourself, or worse, left a mess for us to deal with." Margaret winced, clutching a small shard that had pricked her finger. Before she could respond, Clara's voice grew colder. "One day, I swear, I'll call the police and have you removed if you can't follow the rules in this house." The words cut deeper than the glass. Margaret's throat tightened as humiliation swept over her. She wanted to explain, to remind Clara that she was her mother, not a stranger. But instead, she nodded silently, wiping her finger with a tissue. The broken pieces on the floor seemed to mirror the quiet shattering. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and cut grass. Margaret wandered into the backyard, her steps slow but steady, drawn to the garden like a moth to a flame. Once, this small patch of earth had been her pride, a place where roses climbed the fence, mint grew wild in the corner, and daisies turned their heads toward the sun. She crouched down beside a bare patch of soil, running her fingers through the dry dirt. Memories bloomed in her mind. Little Clara, no older than 7, chasing butterflies between the rose bushes, her laughter ringing like bells. Margaret remembered teaching her how to plant marigold seeds, the two of them kneeling side by side, their hands stained with earth. Now, weeds tangled around the edges, and the roses had long withered. Clara no longer cared for the garden. Too busy, too dismissive. To her daughter, these flowers were not cherished memories, but clutter to be cleared away. Margaret sighed, brushing dirt from her palms. A heavy ache pressed on her chest as the truth settled in. She was no longer part of Clara's idea of home. She was not mother, not family, only a burden tolerated within these walls. The garden that once held laughter now echoed with silence, a reflection of how far Clara's heart had drifted from hers. The year was 1983, and the chill of autumn clung to the small New England town as Margaret and Thomas stood on the cracked walkway of a weary Victorian house. Its paint peeled in long strips, shutters hung crooked, and the porch sagged like an old man's shoulders. Most buyers had dismissed it as hopeless, but to them, it was possibility, an empty canvas on which to build a life. Margaret, in her early 30s, clutched the realtor's papers tightly, her eyes shining with cautious hope. Thomas, strong and steady beside her, squeezed her hand. "It's not much now," he said with a grin, "but give us a few years, this place will be a home." The weeks that followed were filled with endless work. Thomas patched the roof in the biting cold, while Margaret scrubbed years of dust and painted walls until her arms ached. They slept on a mattress on the floor, cooking simple meals over a hot plate when the kitchen was gutted. Yet even in exhaustion, they laughed, spilled paint on shoes, shared midnight tea by lantern light, and dreamed aloud of the family they would raise within these walls. Neighbors shook their heads at the sacrifice, but Margaret and Thomas saw only promise. Every nail hammered, every board replaced, stitched the house into the fabric of their love. It wasn't just a house being rebuilt. It was a future, fragile but radiant, waiting to unfold. The Evans household never overflowed with wealth, but it brimmed with warmth. The old Victorian, once hollow and broken, now pulsed with life. Its walls, freshly painted in soft creams and blues, bore the faint smudges of tiny handprints, marks Margaret never bothered to scrub away, for they reminded her of Clara's laughter echoing through the halls. Saturdays became family days. Thomas would roll up his sleeves and tackle small repairs, humming as he worked, while Margaret prepared stews and fresh bread, filling the house with comforting aromas. Clara, wide-eyed and curious, perched on a stool beside her mother, learning how to stir the pot without spilling, her cheeks flushed with pride at every small success. Evenings often ended around the dining table, lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. They played board games, shared stories, or simply enjoyed the quiet companionship of one another. Vacations were rare, luxuries scarce, yet happiness thrived in simple rituals: a painted bedroom wall, fresh flowers from the garden, pancakes on Sunday mornings. The Victorian house, once forgotten and decayed, grew into a living testament of sacrifice, laughter, and devotion. For Margaret, every creak of the floorboards and every corner of the home whispered the same truth: love had made it whole, and family had made it sacred. The Evans household never overflowed with wealth, but it brimmed with warmth. The old Victorian, once hollow and broken, now pulsed with life. Its walls, freshly painted in soft creams and blues, bore the faint smudges of tiny handprints, marks Margaret never bothered to scrub away, for they reminded her of Clara's laughter echoing through the halls. Saturdays became family days. Thomas would roll up his sleeves and tackle small repairs, humming as he worked, while Margaret prepared stews and fresh bread, filling the house with comforting aromas. Clara, wide-eyed and curious, perched on a stool beside her mother, learning how to stir the pot without spilling, her cheeks flushed with pride at every small success. Evenings often ended around the dining table, lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. They played board games, shared stories, or simply enjoyed the quiet companionship of one another. Vacations were rare, luxuries scarce, yet happiness thrived in simple rituals: a painted bedroom wall, fresh flowers from the garden, pancakes on Sunday mornings. The Victorian house, once forgotten and decayed, grew into a living testament of sacrifice, laughter, and devotion. For Margaret, every creak of the floorboards and every corner of the home whispered the same truth: love had made it whole, and family had made it sacred. Time, which once felt endless within the Evans home, began to slip through Margaret's fingers like sand. Thomas, once strong and tireless, grew frail with each passing season. His laughter, once booming through the hallways, softened into quiet smiles, and his hands that had built the house board by board, trembled when he tried to hold a teacup. Margaret noticed first in the garden, when he could no longer lift the watering can. Soon, it was the stairs that became too steep, the walks to town too long. The doctor's words confirmed what Margaret had feared. Thomas was gravely ill, and there was no cure, only time. She became his shadow, his strength. She fluffed pillows, cooked gentle meals he could manage, and read to him in the evenings when his voice grew too weak. Often, she sat beside his bed and held his hand, tracing the lines of his palm as though memorizing every detail. One winter night, as snow dusted the windows, Thomas whispered to her, "You made this house a home, Maggie. Promise me you'll keep living in it, even when I can't." His breath was shallow, but his eyes carried the same love that had guided them through decades. When the end came, it was quiet, Thomas asleep, his hand in hers, the fire crackling faintly in the hearth. Margaret pressed her forehead to his and wept, not only for the man she had lost, but for the chapter of life that closed with him. The house, once filled with laughter, now echoed with silence. Yet in its walls, in every brick and beam, Thomas's love. The days after Thomas's passing stretched endlessly, each one heavy with silence. Margaret wandered the Victorian halls like a ghost, pausing often at his chair by the fire or the empty side of the bed. The house that had once embraced her with warmth now seemed cavernous and cold, echoing only her footsteps. Clara, sensing her mother's loneliness, extended an invitation. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone in that old place. Come stay with Daniel and me. We have plenty of room, and it'll be easier for everyone." The offer carried both comfort and hesitation. Margaret looked around her beloved home, touching the worn banister Thomas had repaired, the kitchen where she had baked countless loaves of bread, the garden where Clara once played. Parting with it felt like leaving him behind. Yet the ache of solitude pressed harder each night, and the thought of family, of not eating dinner alone, softened her resistance. She packed slowly, folding clothes into neat stacks, placing a few framed photographs in a box. With each item, memories tugged at her heart, but she reminded herself, Clara wanted her close. Perhaps this would be a new chapter, one where she was still needed. When she arrived at Clara and Daniel's suburban home, Margaret was greeted with polite smiles and hurried words. Her suitcase was placed in a small upstairs room, tidy but impersonal. She told herself it didn't matter. What mattered was being near her daughter. At first, Margaret tried to tread lightly in Clara's house, reminding herself that she was a guest. But it didn't take long before Clara's tone shifted from welcoming to managerial. One evening at dinner, she laid out the expectations as if reading from a list. "No guests without asking me first," Clara said, her fork tapping against the plate. "And please, no late-night TV. It keeps Daniel awake. Oh, and the kitchen needs to stay clean. No clutter." Margaret nodded quietly, her appetite fading with every word. She thought of the old Victorian, where friends could stop by unannounced, where late-night tea and television had been her comfort, where her books and knitting needles could rest wherever she pleased. In Clara's home, those freedoms were gone. Margaret began to live cautiously, afraid of leaving a cup in the sink too long or forgetting to turn down the volume on the television. She even stopped humming to herself, worried it might be considered noise. Her small upstairs room grew to feel more like a rented space than a sanctuary. The family photographs on the walls were Clara's and Daniel's, none of hers. Even her belongings, tucked neatly in corners, seemed out of place. One night, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the muffled laughter of Clara and Daniel downstairs. She realized, with a sinking weight in her chest, that she was not living as family here. She was a tenant without rent, tolerated under conditions, her presence more managed than welcomed. And though she tried to silence the thought, it was late, the house dim and quiet except for the faint murmur of voices drifting up from the living room. Margaret, unable to sleep, slipped from her bed to fetch a glass of water. As she passed the top of the stairs, she froze. The sound of Clara's voice carried clearly through the stillness. "She's just emotional clutter, Daniel," Clara said, her tone edged with irritation. "It's like having an extra weight in the house. She's not really part of our lives anymore. She just lingers." Daniel sighed, his voice low. "I know it's hard, but she is your mother." Clara's reply was sharper. "I didn't sign up to babysit an old woman. She doesn't belong here." The words struck Margaret like a blow. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed a trembling hand to the wall for support. Emotional clutter, not family. She retreated silently to her room, careful not to let the floor creak. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she clutched the glass of water she had never drunk, her eyes brimming with tears. In her mind, images of years past unfurled, Clara as a little girl running barefoot in the garden, curling up in Margaret's lap during thunderstorms, whispering, "Don't leave me, Mama." Now, that same daughter dismissed her as nothing more than an inconvenience. Margaret pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob, afraid of being heard, afraid of being a further burden. In that silence, a hollow realization settled into her heart. Her home, her place, her worth in her daughter's eyes had vanished. She was not mother anymore. She was clutter. And nothing hurt more than being unwanted by the child she had once given everything for. The dining room buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses as Clara and Daniel hosted their weekend dinner party. Friends and neighbors filled the table, laughing at stories, praising the meal, and toasting to success. Margaret had helped prepare the roast earlier in the day, quietly seasoning and peeling vegetables while Clara orchestrated the event. As dessert was served, one of the guests complimented the cozy atmosphere. "It must be wonderful having family around," the woman said, glancing warmly at Margaret. Clara let out a sharp laugh, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, Mom? She's just our little freeloader. Always here, but never contributing much." The words sliced through the air, followed by an awkward chuckle or two from the guests who didn't know how to respond. Margaret's cheeks burned as every eye turned briefly toward her. She forced a polite smile, lowering her gaze to the untouched slice of pie in front of her. Inside, her heart crumbled. She remembered decades of sacrifices, the nights she and Thomas skipped meals so Clara could have shoes for school, the long hours she worked to keep the family afloat, the home she had built with her own hands. To hear her daughter reduce her to a burden, and to do so publicly, felt like a betrayal beyond words. She wanted to speak, to remind Clara that she was her mother, not a stray guest overstaying her welcome. But the lump in her throat held her silent. So she sat quietly, her fork unmoved, listening to the laughter around her, a world in which she no longer belonged. When the evening ended and the guests left, Margaret slipped away to her room, clutching her chest. Clara's words replayed in her mind, each repetition heavier than the last. Freeloader. One rainy afternoon, while searching through her small box of keepsakes, Margaret stumbled upon a stack of mail addressed to her. Most were routine, bank statements, insurance notices, but one thick envelope bore the name of a county office. Curious, she opened it carefully. Her eyes scanned the contents, and her breath caught. It was paperwork regarding the old Victorian house. But something was wrong. The signature on the ownership transfer form, her signature, looked shaky and foreign, nothing like her own. She flipped through the pages, horror tightening in her chest as the truth revealed itself. Clara had forged her name, attempting to claim the house as her own. Margaret sat frozen, the documents spread across her lap, her hands trembling. The house wasn't just a piece of property, it was the heart of her life with Thomas, the foundation of every memory they had built. To see Clara reduce it to a transaction, and worse, to try and steal it through deceit, was a wound deeper than any insult. Her mind reeled with questions. How long had Clara planned this? Had her invitation to live in the suburban home been less about care and more about control? Margaret pressed the papers to her chest, tears blurring her vision. Betrayal seeped into every corner of her being. Not only had Clara dismissed her as a burden, but now she sought to erase Margaret's claim to the very place where love had once flourished. For the first time, a seed of quiet defiance stirred inside her. Clara could take her dignity with cruel words, but she would not take that house, not while Margaret still had breath to fight. Margaret waited until evening, the forged documents clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart pounded as she walked into the living room, where Clara sat scrolling on her phone, a glass of wine balanced beside her. "Clara," Margaret began softly, though her voice trembled, "I found these papers today. Why is my signature on them? Why are you trying to take the house?" Clara's head snapped up, her expression flashing from surprise to fury in an instant. "You went through my things," she snapped, standing abruptly. "These were mailed to me," Margaret replied, her grip tightening on the papers. "That house is mine, Clara. Your father and I built our lives there. You have no right." "No right?" Clara's voice rose, shrill with anger. "I've done everything for you. I took you in when you were alone, fed you, gave you a roof. And you repay me by questioning me? That house should be mine. It's wasted on you." Margaret's throat tightened. "Wasted? Clara, it's my home, the only place where I still feel close to your father." Clara's face hardened, her voice dropping to an icy threat. If you don't stop meddling, I'll call the police and have you removed from this house. Do you understand me? Don't push me, Mother. The word mother dripped with venom, not love. Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, the room spinning as her daughter's rage crashed over her. She said nothing more, her silence the only shield she had left. But inside, something shifted. The bond between them, already fragile, fractured beyond repair. For the first time, Margaret realized Clara was no longer her little girl. She had become a stranger willing to cast her own mother out. The house was cloaked in silence, the kind that only comes in the deepest hours of night. Margaret sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the forged documents spread across the blanket beside her. Clara's threats echoed in her ears, sharp and unforgiving. She knew now, if she stayed, she would lose not just her dignity, but the last piece of her life that was truly hers. With trembling hands, she pulled an old suitcase from beneath the bed. Every movement was careful, deliberate. She folded a few dresses, a sweater Thomas had once loved on her, and the framed photograph of their wedding day. Her fingers lingered on the glass before she slipped it gently between layers of clothing. At the very bottom, she tucked the most important item, the original deed to the Victorian house, worn but intact, proof that it was still hers. She held it for a moment against her chest, whispering, "I won't let them take you." The clock struck 2. She eased the suitcase zipper closed, its sound impossibly loud in the stillness. With slow, cautious steps, she crept down the hallway, pausing when the floor creaked. From downstairs came only the steady hum of the refrigerator, Daniel's faint snore through the walls. Clara slept soundly, unaware. Margaret slipped out the back door into the cool night. The air smelled of damp earth and freedom. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, the suitcase bumping against her leg as she walked down the street with no clear destination, only the fierce determination to reclaim what was hers. Behind her, Clara's house loomed in the dark, but Margaret didn't look back. For the first time in years, each step she took was her own. The morning after her escape, Margaret sat in a small cafe downtown, her suitcase tucked at her feet. The weight of sleeplessness pressed against her eyes, but determination kept her upright. She unfolded the deed again, running her fingers over the faded ink. It was her lifeline, proof that not all had been stolen. She thought of someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Robert Miller, an old friend of Thomas's, who had once handled their legal papers. Gathering her courage, she dialed his office. To her relief, his familiar, steady voice answered, surprised but warm. "Margaret Evans? My goodness, it's been a long time." Within an hour, she was sitting across from him in his modest office. Robert, older now but still sharp-eyed, adjusted his glasses as she slid the deed across the desk. "Clara tried to forge my signature," Margaret explained softly, her voice breaking. "She wants to take the house." Robert studied the papers carefully, his brow furrowing. Then he leaned back, meeting her anxious gaze. "Margaret, you have nothing to fear. This deed is valid. The house is still legally yours, and only yours. No forged document can change that." The relief was overwhelming. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed a hand to her mouth, a soft sob escaping. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt the ground beneath her steady again. Robert reached across the desk, his tone firm but kind. "You've been through a lot, Margaret. But you're not powerless. If your daughter tries anything further, the law will protect you. Thomas made sure of that when he left everything in your name." Margaret nodded, clutching the deed tightly. For so long, she had felt invisible, voiceless. But now, with Robert's reassurance, a flicker of strength returned. Clara could belittle her, threaten her, even betray her, but she could not erase. With Robert's reassurance still echoing in her mind, Margaret knew what she had to do. The Victorian house, though filled with memories, had become a tether, a prize Clara would never stop reaching for. If she wanted peace, she had to let it go, on her own terms. One morning, Sitting in the corner of the cafe with her tea, she noticed a business card pinned to the community board. Sophia Trand, Realtor. Honest. Efficient. Discreet. The word discreet caught Margaret's eye. That was exactly what she needed. She dialed the number, her hands trembling slightly. A warm, confident voice answered. This is Sophia. Within hours, they met at the Victorian house. Margaret unlocked the door, the familiar creak of the hinges greeting her like an old friend. Dust lingered in the air, and the rooms, though worn, still held echoes of laughter, of Thomas's voice, of Clara's childhood giggles. Sophia walked through each room with professional calm, taking notes and photographs. It's a beautiful property, she said gently, sensing Margaret's hesitation. With the right buyer, it can shine again. Are you sure you want to sell? Margaret's throat tightened. She ran her hand over the wooden banister Thomas had sanded smooth decades ago. Yes, she whispered. It's time. I can't keep holding on, not when it's become a weapon in my daughter's hands. Sophia nodded with understanding. Then we'll move quickly and quietly. I'll make sure the process is smooth. You deserve that. Margaret felt an unexpected surge of relief. She wasn't losing the house. She was reclaiming her freedom. By choosing to sell, she was deciding for herself, not allowing Clara to decide for her. As she locked the door behind them, Margaret glanced once more at the windows, the garden beyond, the house that had been her life. It hurt, but beneath the ache was something new, resolve. The past would stay here. The process moved faster than Margaret ever imagined. Sophia worked with quiet efficiency, finding a buyer who fell in love with the old Victorian almost immediately. Diana Harper, 55, a woman with kind eyes and a hopeful smile, walked through the house as if she already belonged there. I've just come out of a long, difficult chapter, Diana confided softly to Margaret during the final viewing. I need a place where I can start fresh. This house feels alive, like it still has love to give. Margaret's heart ached at the words, but she saw truth in them. Perhaps the house was ready to hold someone else's dreams, the way it had once held hers and Thomas's. She pressed Diana's hand gently. Take good care of it, she whispered. Within days, the papers were signed, the sale finalized. Margaret watched as her name was officially transferred from the deed, by her choice, not Clara's manipulation. The check in her hand was more than money, it was freedom. Meanwhile, across town, Clara opened her mail to find an official eviction notice. Shock turned her face pale. She had assumed the house was hers for the taking, a silent inheritance she could snatch before her mother noticed. Instead, it was gone, sold to a stranger, out of her reach forever. Furious, Clara dialed Margaret's number, but the call went unanswered. For the first time, control had slipped from her grasp. Margaret, sitting quietly in her modest hotel room, folded the notice she knew would soon reach her daughter. She imagined Clara's disbelief, her outrage, her desperate scramble to understand. And for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself a small, steady smile. The house was no longer a battlefield. It was no longer Clara's weapon. It was Margaret's victory, sealed and complete. The city apartment was smaller than the Victorian, but to Margaret, it felt vast. Every corner her own, every rule her own. Sunlight poured through wide windows onto freshly painted walls. She furnished the space simply. A cozy chair by the window, a small dining table, a bed dressed in clean linens. For the first time in years, there was no one to scold her for leaving a book on the counter or turning the television up too loud. On the narrow balcony, Margaret placed a row of pots. In one, she planted mint, the same herb she had once tended in her garden decades ago. Each morning, she stepped outside, inhaled the sharp, refreshing scent, and felt the weight of the past loosening its grip. Days flowed peacefully, quiet mornings with tea, afternoons strolling through the market, evenings writing letters she never sent. She had carved out a new rhythm, one that belonged wholly to her. Then one evening, her phone buzzed. Clara's name flashed on the screen. Against her better judgment, Margaret answered. Mom, Clara's voice cracked with desperation. Daniel and I are struggling. We need help. Can you loan us some money, just until things get better? For a long moment, Margaret said nothing, her heart torn between old instincts and hard-earned resolve. She thought of the insults, the threats, the betrayal etched into every word Clara had once spat at her. Slowly, she exhaled. No, Clara, she said firmly, her voice steady, unshaken. I can't help you. Not this time. There was silence on the other end, then the faint sound of Clara's sob before the call disconnected. Margaret set the phone down, her hand trembling only slightly. She stepped onto the balcony, the evening breeze brushing against her face, and leaned over the mint leaves, their scent sharp and alive. For the first time in decades, she felt wholly, undeniably free. Thank you so much for watching Margaret's heartbreaking yet inspiring story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can hear it.